life is like a game, and knowing how to network properly, whether it's for personal gain or not, is a very valuable skill. On the menu today at Sarah's Soju Cafe is apple cider, so grab your mugs and let's chat about networking in your 20s. Welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, and soju shotties, to another episode of Soju with Sarah. I'm your host, Sarah, and today we are talking about networking in your 20s. The reason why I wanted to talk about this topic is because I personally feel like all of us have come into contact with the networking world, whether it's interacting with people who are social networkers or career networkers, or being the person who is the social networker or a career networker. There's no positive or negative connotation to that. But today I wanted to dive into it because I feel like there's not enough literacy around networking. Growing up, I was never taught anything about networking, and I feel like I had to figure it out a lot on my own starting from college. And in general, I feel like I actually don't have that many conversations either with my friends or James, my boyfriend, or my family about what exactly networking is. But before we get into the episode, let's do a little drink of the day. I have my not soju mug, so today we are drinking apple cider, and I am starting to crave a little bit of a non-alcoholic winter season. I don't know if we'll make it through. I know it's a little bit counterintuitive to the podcast because the podcast is called Soju with Sarah. Ideally, we would have a soju drink a week, but I just feel like this season I want to maybe stay a little bit dry. So that is why we have apple cider. I also quite like apple cider. I feel like a lot of the drinks that we get end up just going into the fridge and then we don't really repurpose it. So I'm trying to be a little bit more sustainable with all the drinks that we get for the podcast. So there might be a little bit more repeat drinks, but we do have apple cider. And a little bit of a life update before we jump into the episode. This is probably going to be one of the last episodes that I film in this apartment, which is very sad. I feel like this is the home, like my literal home actually, but it's also the home of this podcast and its origins. Even though we have not been around for more than half a year, I feel so sad and sentimental about having to leave this apartment. But if you guys follow me on my main channel, you will probably get the first view of the new space. I'm very excited to move to a new space. I just wanted to batch a little bit of the episodes for Soju with Sarah before we move, just so that we have weekly episodes that you guys can listen to while we're in the process of moving. I know moving can be so chaotic, and I just don't want to be in a position where I have to rush film an episode while we're there and have like no place to film. But I'm excited for the next chapter, and it's going to be a bit of a change for us. But I do think that every new step we make in life is almost always going to take us further along our journeys. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the new space. We're moving next week. And by the time that you guys see this, we'll probably have already been moved. So that's just a quick little life update. James is not here today to be sad about it. He's actually more sad than I am. And I think it's just because I haven't had time to process yet. However, changes are coming. And this is the little inside scoop that I'll be sharing with you guys today. Anyways, getting into the episode. Today we are talking about networking, and specifically networking in adulthood. I feel like that is when networking becomes most prominent. As a kid, there's not really much of a need to network. And then once you enter college, you start realizing that people take steps to meet others, either in a profession, in a social class, in a different status bracket as you, and there's a lot to unpack there. But for anyone who is not familiar with networking, I have pulled up a definition that I'm going to read right now, which is networking is the process of building and maintaining relationships with people, often with the goal of exchanging information, resources, or support. It's commonly used to advance personal, social, or professional goals such as finding job opportunities, collaborating on projects, gaining insight, or simply expanding one's circle. Networking can take place in various settings like social events, conferences, or online platforms, and it's an essential skill for career and personal development. I think for a lot of us, we're not taught how to network and what the proper way to network with people is. And so for me, my first foray into networking was in college. Honestly, I think when I entered college, I just had wholesome intentions of meeting people that I connected with and that I resonated with. And I never had any desire to meet people outside of my personal interest. And so I think I had a very narrow view of what it meant to socialize and make friends. And I think by the end of my 4 years in college, I gained this idea, or I gained this clarity around who you should actually try to meet in life. And it's not to say that you shouldn't make friends with people that you vibe with and that you resonate with, but there's also this whole world of meeting people to have some broader benefit than just hanging out and spending time together. I always had this negative feeling when it came to social networking or networking in general, because in college, I feel like there was this negative connotation when it came to people who were quote unquote clout chasers, social climbers, or networkers. And so for that reason, in college, I feel like there were a handful of people that were really, really good at coffee chatting and reaching out to people on LinkedIn or going to career fairs and managing to secure internships through that. And I feel like there was also a handful of people that were really good at social climbing. And I think social climbing is the most prevalent first instance of networking that we see early on in our youth, which is when people try to befriend other people that are more popular, more cool, or more socially above you in status, and to make your way up in the social ladder through that. I guess at that point in your life, you're not really preoccupied with money and wealth and income bracket yet, but then everything about popularity and coolness is still present. And for me, when I was in college, because people would speak negatively about people who are social climbers, I felt this really strong resistance to being labeled a social climber. And I think I proactively restricted myself from social climbing because I felt like I quote unquote knew my place. But then the other instance that I started seeing in college, especially the last 2 years, is career climbing and social networking for career benefits. And in college, that presents as people getting referrals for internships or full-time jobs, people reaching out to career professionals at a certain company for coffee chats and to connect. And at that point, I hadn't really done much of that myself, but it was purely through observation of other people engaging in these networking type behaviors that made me realize that there's this whole world of networking that helps to advance you in your careers. A lot of the friends that I knew that were really plugged into networking and really knew how to do it, they would manage to get really great job offers and they would manage to secure internships earlier than other people. And it really baffled me because I didn't know that that was kind of like the door into career opportunities. So that summarizes how I got introduced to the concept of networking. But before we actually dive into some ways to network and like what that actually looks like, I did some mental math earlier in trying to categorize different types of networking and how I think networking presents on a day-to-day basis. And even if you're not someone who actively thinks about networking, this might just show up in your life as something you naturally are inclined to do or that you see other people around you doing. And actually, before we dive into the different types of networking that occurs, I wanted to preface that there is no quote unquote bad form of networking. By that, I mean that none of these are inherently bad, like on a moral and ethical level. I think there's this weird impression that a lot of people have that social climbers and networkers are inherently bad and dishonest and they have malintention behind their actions, when I think life is like a game and knowing how to network properly, whether it's for personal gain or not, is a very valuable skill, which we'll dive into like the ethics of it too later. And I have a lot to say because I feel like I was so resistant, like I mentioned early on in my 20s, that it kind of restricted me from actually making good connections that I feel like I would have now. But I want to start off with the first type of networking, which I think is the natural type of networking that we're most accustomed to, which is wholesome networking. I didn't know what other word to categorize it as, but I think wholesome networking is a good way to describe it. It's basically when you go into the networking without any specific intention, but just to make friends, just to find fulfillment and happiness and joy in a friendship or a connection that you've made. I think a lot of us use this as a baseline type of networking that we lean onto whenever we're in a new social context. So making friends and finding people that you want to spend your time with. And I think wholesome networking in my head is what I used to think of as good socialization. And then every other type in my head I categorized as bad, which later I learned was not the right way to look at things. Because the next type of networking that I think is most common is status/influence/ social networking. This is the type of networking where the underlying purpose and goal is for social advancement, whether it is in social status, clout, or reputation. And I think this happens a lot when you see friendships that form between celebrities and non-celebrities. Obviously, not all of them are for the purpose of like social networking. There's some genuine friendships that come out of those relationships. But I think this happens a lot in industries where there is some importance put into reputation. However, I do think this also presents just in day-to-day life where you might want to associate yourself with the people who are quote unquote cool or more popular. I also have a hot take, which is I think this category is also more of a vanity metric or like a vanity play. And the underlying goal is really all about public image rather than something more career oriented or financially oriented. I think the next step into networking that I started experiencing once I started having my first internship and also working a full corporate job is career networking. And this is networking on the basis of furthering your professional life. And so I've seen this manifest in many ways. I think I mentioned coffee chats, like reaching out on LinkedIn and having coffee chats with people as one way that this shows up. As an engineer working at a big tech company, I've honestly received so many inquiries about my job and people requesting coffee chats. And even within the company, I've received coffee chat requests before where people want to switch teams and they want to kind of talk to someone on the team, see what career opportunities there are within the team. And it's something that I don't do nearly as much as I think I should. I think with professional networking, there's the benefit of being able to learn and grow faster than if you try to figure out everything yourself. But a lot of what career networking is, I think, is trying to expedite some process within your career. Most of the time, I think this is like a vertical progression where you're trying to move up the ladder as much as possible. I have seen horizontal career networking too, where people want to jump into new industries and try to experience a new role, and you try to meet people in other industries and other roles through that. But mostly this is all about expediting your career growth and maximizing your potential for opportunities and promotions and other opportunities of that sort. The next one, which is a little bit more niche, is knowledge networking. And I think this is something later into my career. Like once you become more senior in your line of work or your hobbies or anything else in your life, this is where you become, I don't want to use the word victim because it's not really being a victim, but you are the source that people go to for anything related to some topic. I think a good example of this is when I was early doing content creation, I kind of just did it in isolation, didn't really have to think much. But after doing it for a couple of years, anytime any of my friends have content related questions, they all funnel into me. There's nothing harmful about it. It's all about like sharing information, sharing the wealth of knowledge that we have. But there are in certain cases where I've seen people befriend me for knowledge, whether it is about engineering and becoming an engineer and kind of getting their foot in the door with job opportunities, but also being able to benefit from the experience that I've had being a content creator and try to learn through that. And sometimes it's been purely with the intention of just learning from what I've done with my content career. I think there's been a couple of times where someone has not done content before and they reached out only to ask me questions about things like what camera gear do you use, how do you edit, and other things like that. And I think in those cases, I never know how to really like process it because I do want to help, but at the same time, I also sometimes feel used. And I think when it comes to networking, when you're on the opposite end of the networker, it's very easy to feel like you're being used if you can perceive their intention really clearly. And I think that's what I grappled with a lot when I was younger, trying to figure out whether or not it was good or bad that someone was networking. But I personally think if it's not harmful and people have good intentions and they treat you respectfully, I don't think networking is a bad thing. This was a complete side tangent, but I do think there's a level and a delicacy to being a good networker that I think is also a learned skill. So we can talk about that a little bit later. But I do think the purpose of knowledge networking is generally to gain knowledge around a career or profession, a hobby even, or just general life growth that I think is very valuable. And especially if you're, for example, learning pottery for the first time, making friends with people who are more senior and have experience building pieces and throwing on the wheel, and that can help you. The next one is mentorship networking. And in my life, I feel like mentorship networking has generally just fallen into place. On a whole, I think I'm actually quite bad at mentorship networking. And on this list of networking categories and types, I think I'm not very good at most of them. But mentorship networking is basically searching for wisdom in others, and it doesn't mean that they have to be older. I think that's like a common misconception. I think when it comes to mentorship networking, it just means that you're seeking advice and guidance from someone who's gone through it before. A lot of the times that does mean someone is older, but I've seen in some off-case scenarios where someone who is younger than me will have much more wisdom about some specific topic that I'm doing for the first time. There's also a level of like broadness when it comes to mentorship networking. I feel like you can find mentors who literally are just life mentors that kind of guide you through random things, but you can also make it very niche. And going back to the question of how I found my mentors, I guess, in the past, one of my mentors is just my tech lead from my previous team that I had been working with for 2 years, and he is older than me and he has kids and a family. So I feel like he's gone through many levels of life that I haven't been through yet. But I think the mentorship just naturally developed because when I was leaving the team, I remember I was so sad and a little bit sentimental about having to leave because I worked really closely with my TL, and I think I was one out of like 2 people that he was leading back then. And he actually suggested when I left the team that I set up quarterly check-ins with him. And I think that's how the mentorship started forming, where I was making a career transition and moving on to my next team. But there were remnants of like a previous team and a previous teammate that I kind of carried over. And I think that's been very helpful because when I check in with him every quarter now, I feel like it's a very good balance of he's not working with me too closely, so he doesn't know all the scope of my work, but he also tries to give me like life advice and career advice and relationship advice sometimes. And I feel like I'm really willing to share a lot with him too because I have worked with him in the past. And so it kind of resembles like a father figure in a way. And I don't know if he listens to this podcast, maybe he does, but I think this is one of the career mentorships that I've valued the most. And in the past, I think it's been more of a direct mentorship through the work that I'm doing that I meet consistently with my manager and other people on my team. But this one has carried over from my last team and I think has helped me a lot to grow into myself as an engineer, but also just as a person. But that's mentorship networking. And I feel like it's always good to have mentors in your life. And that's the type of advice I hear often, which is you should have a mentor in different parts of your life so that you have someone to turn to when it comes to advice. But moving on, the next type of networking is what I like to call the IOU networker. This is basically casting a super wide social net to capture as many IOUs as you can. And so the underlying purpose for this type of networking is not very clearly defined because usually there is no explicit initial reason, but I've actually kind of like learned about this through being someone that has benefited from, but also been the source of an IOU networking, if that makes sense. I don't think that was a grammatically incorrect sentence, but basically the IOU networking is befriending and meeting different types of people in different industries, different demographics to establish good rapport with those people so that later down the line, if there's anything that they need them for, be it a monetary investment or public support. And this also means that you're going to be in the good graces of a lot of people. And I think this is actually the hardest type of networking to do, in my opinion, because it requires you to be present and to always be actively networking so that you collect as many IOUs as possible. I think another good way to describe this is the value add networking. And by that, I mean making as many connections as possible where everyone has some form of value add to you and maybe you have some form of value add to them. And actually, to amend what I said about purpose earlier, I think the purpose of the IOU networking strategy is to basically build out a security blanket for any of life situations. So if anything happens, you always have someone to call on your phone or someone to message and DM to help you out. This type of networking, I think, requires a lot of maintenance on friendships and connections as well. And I see this a lot in startup founders, and the correlation might be kind of self-explanatory, but I feel like in the past when I've met startup founders, they're very nice to me. They never ask me for anything until down the line. And again, I don't think it's a bad thing. I'm always keen to help and I always love to help. And especially when it comes to being able to meet people that are doing cool things, I love to be inspired. But I've noticed that in one-off times when I'm speaking to startup founders, they'll offer something off the bat to me and it'll be really surprising. Like there was one time I had met someone through another friend and I had mentioned that I was interested in, seeing what the startup world was like and being plugged into that. And immediately she was like, oh, let me invite you to this startup founder dinner that I am hosting. And I really appreciated that because she was really open and like welcoming when it came to offering something that she didn't necessarily need to offer. I think it was just like a one-off comment that I had made, but on a networking strategy basis, it forms this good connection and bond where they've done something kind to you and that down the line, they'll ask something maybe out of you. But the last thing that I wanted to say with all of these networking types and these categories is that one, there's no good and bad. Most of the time, I feel like it's about how you approach it and how you treat the networking that determines how people perceive it. And the second is a lot of the times I think there's overlap. So most of the connections you make are not just going to fit into one of these networking categories. So knowledge networking might overlap with social networking, where you befriend someone to get more knowledge on something, but then you become plugged into like this new social group or a social community. Or sometimes career networking can fall into mentorship, which kind of is what happened with me and my mentor. But also an IOU can turn into a wholesome relationship and a wholesome connection. If anything, I think most types of networking are a good mix of wholesome and something else or multiple things. But I just wanted to flag that because when I categorize things like this, it's never to say that things fit perfectly into each category. I think there's a lot of nuance when it comes to networking, and going into one of those nuances, which is the negative connotation of networking. I think there's generally so much stigma around the term networking because it's so closely tied to clout chasing and social climbing, when a lot of the times networking is driven by this desire to advance your life and advance your career in one direction. And a lot of the times, I actually think social networking is mutually beneficial to both parties. Sometimes it's not, but it's part of the game of life. And something I've learned as I've gotten older is if you don't like the rules of the game of life and you don't play it, then you're kind of just screwing yourself over. And it's not to say you should participate in everything that life offers, good or bad, but I do think networking is a very natural part of progression in life that is, like I mentioned, a hard skill to learn. Maybe I'm making this up, but there's a saying like, if you don't play the game of life, then you lose. Or maybe it's if you don't play the game of life, then the game of life plays you. But in that same vein, I think as I get older, I realize that networking is also a little bit of a life hack. And to kind of explain that, I think a lot of successful people put in hard work and effort and time into their craft and whatever they do. But there's an added element of being able to benefit from something like a one-off $500 donation or the support of someone who has knowledge about manufacturing if you're thinking of creating products and building things out. Like it lets you skip some levels of hardship that you would need to experience on your own if you're not leaning into help from other people. And I think that's something that when I was a kid, I resisted a lot because I felt like I could do everything myself. But then now that I'm older, I realize a lot of people get further in life when they ask for help and when they put themselves into situations where they're more likely to receive help. And I think that's just like the big keyword is social networking correlates a lot to help, and help in some form, whether it's gaining knowledge, money, status, reputation, different things like that. I think it's also a common misconception that networking is slimy or sneaky because the underlying intention isn't always the most pure. But something that I've learned through experience is even when someone is networking with you for some specific reason, it also does sometimes result in you benefiting from it. And so I think about the times that I've met people who have offered me favors to kind of be in the good graces of me. And I, in return, have benefited from those opportunities, whether it is meeting other people through them because they opened an invitation up to me to join something, or it's that I learned something through them in the process of me helping them. So that's how I've started to slowly ease into the idea of being networked with, but also being someone who networks. I am very notoriously bad at networking. Like, I am still in the process of trying to form my opinions and thoughts and moving towards that world where I am networking organically in my day-to-day life. But I do think there's a lot of merits to it that people don't really talk about. And then also one last thing, going back to the idea of networking being a life hack. If you think about the butterfly effect, which is basically that small, seemingly like insignificant occurrences in life can have exponentially big impacts in your life. I think it's the same thing where having a broader and wider network of people, friends, connections, it opens the door up to many small things that could be potentially life-changing, whether it is a career opportunity or money. Like on a financial front, it's possible that a $500 investment from someone in your network can be the make or break between if your business succeeds or not. And I think that's the mentality that some people carry into looking at creating connections and meeting people. And then also touching on the idea of networking being the opposite of wholesome. I really think networking is all about how you approach it. And I think there's a very genuine route to networking in any of those categories that you can achieve as someone who networks, as long as you try to be kind and helpful back. There's this idea of relationships being a give-take relationship where you give, but you also get the opportunity to take. And the unhealthy relationships are the ones where you're constantly giving or you're constantly taking. And I think this is all true of being a networker and just being a person in general. I think the reason that people who network have a bad reputation is because sometimes the networking can pass a certain threshold. And so it becomes a take-take relationship. And if you think about in school, if someone copies your homework and they never offer to let you copy their homework, not that copying is a good thing. You guys should not copy if you're still in school. But I think it's the same rationale that someone who always copies your homework and never offers to help you out is going to have a bad reputation. And so that's how I kind of am learning to look at networking, because a lot of the times when I'm meeting people now that I'm like close to my 30s and other people are networking with me and I'm networking with them, that a lot of these friendships or connections that I make have a give-take undertone versus a give-give undertone. And if you're someone who has a hard time rationalizing networking, but wants to be a better networker and wants to do it without feeling icky, which I did when I was younger, I think this is something that's worth unlearning, which is I used to think that self-serving motives always meant bad motives, meaning I would never invest my time into anything that was self-serving that would help me, benefit me, further my career, my finances, my social status, if it is self-serving. And I think it's because being raised in an immigrant household, we're kind of taught to like do things ourselves and never lean on to other people. So obviously when it comes to career progression and personal growth, you don't ever want to rely on other people for that. But it's also this fear of being perceived like I am egotistical and I only care about my own future and my own progress. And I think that's what I've been unlearning, which is it's not inherently bad. Like if your intention is to help yourself in social situations, that doesn't necessarily correlate to something bad. But if you are pushing other people down, then yes, that is bad. So I think that's just one thing that I wanted to flag and say, if you're someone who has a hard time coming over this hurdle of like knowing how you should actually network with people and how much you should index into your own career and your own life and priorities when it comes to socializing. So I hope that makes sense. And I hope that kind of like wraps up this conversation about the ethics and the morals behind social networking and networking in general. And the last thing I wanted to share was just an example of how much I didn't want to be perceived as a social climber or a social networker. Back when I was early in my career and I had just moved to New York, I remember going to brand events for the first time, and through those brand events, I met creators that were much bigger, that were also really cool people. Like I would talk to them and it would feel very natural and easy. And I remember any time afterwards that I had met these big creators and there was a mention of coffee, I would never outwardly reach out to them because I didn't want to be perceived as someone who was trying to climb this numbers game as a creator. And so I actually, instead of it having like a neutral zero impact effect, I think it actually had the reverse. It had like a negative counterproductive effect on to my life, where I actively closed the door on friendships, possibly just wholesome connections that I could have with people, purely because they were of a higher social media caliber as me. And I remember that time explicitly because I think there were a few friendships that I kind of didn't really open myself up to, that I think about sometimes. But I wanted to share that just as a little lesson to you guys, to not put yourself in a negative position just because you don't want to be seen as someone who's clout chasing or networking. And then also the last thing I wanted to say is genuine friendships can actually come out of networking. I say this because I've actually made a few friends from these career chats or from knowledge networking, where maybe I've met someone through pottery because they know more than I do and I start asking them questions about pottery and it becomes a friendship. I think there's just a lot of opportunities to convert specific niche categories into other categories, and then also to just convert that into pure genuine friendship and connections. So yeah. And then now getting into the crux of Networking 101, which is the original topic of this video, is how to actually network and what my tips are for networking. Again, I'm not the best networker. I definitely have so many things I need to improve on when it comes to networking, and pretty much on a day-to-day, I'm just at home. But through the years, I feel like I've learned some things about networking. And if there's anything that I want to help with through this podcast episode, it's how to build healthy habits around networking. So the first tip is lead with value add. Sometimes it's really hard to capture people's attention from like a connection standpoint, and it's important to lead with value in some networking situations, especially the career networking front. I've noticed that it's really, really easy for me to just get ignored and for no one to want to talk to me at a social event where it's mostly startup founders and entrepreneurs, because personally I don't have a startup and I don't have a business that I can really sell. And I remember at one of the dinner parties that I mentioned, we were going around in a circle talking about what we do. And I remember everyone had amazing stories, amazing businesses, and it got to me. And I said, I'm an engineer and I also do content. And I remember no one wanted to talk to me at that party. But I think something I've learned from observing other people that are really great with career networking, knowledge networking, social networking is they always lead with the value add that they can provide other people. And so it's not really saying outwardly like, oh, hi, my name is Sarah, I can share your business on my Instagram. It's more that you make an intentional effort to highlight the parts of you that are most interesting or valuable to other people. And I remember something that James used to tell me is to stop leading with I'm a software engineer when I go to creator events, because even though it is true at these creator events, it's pretty pointless for me to mention my profession like that when most of the time people there are just looking to meet other creators, connect on a creator level. So I think it just is reframing who you are to people depending on the situation. And I'm not the strongest proponent of reframing yourself because it feels like you're not genuinely representing yourself the way that you want. But I do think when it comes to networking, especially certain types of networking, you have to be intentional about how you're presenting to people. And the wholesomeness and the genuineness comes with it after you form connections with people. And as much as I hate to describe the world of socializing like this, I think that's just one of the things that I've kind of learned through the hard way, being ignored in social situations. Sometimes I fear that the advice I give on this channel is a little too real and a little too harsh, but I do hope this is not too aggressive and that it's a little bit helpful. I think I have this like habit when it comes to being brutally honest that I think I got from my mom, because she is very, very brutally honest with me and my dad and just speaks what's on her mind. But I think when it comes to synthesizing my life experience and the things that go on in my life, I sometimes just write it so literally that I start rambling about what I think and what it exactly looks like in my head. The next tip is really straightforward. It is nurturing the relationship. So when you make a connection, it's important to not just make the connection, but to keep it. And I'm historically notoriously so bad at this. I think I let connections kind of fall through the cracks because I don't put enough attention towards them. And it is mostly a time constraint for me most of the days. But I think it's really important to keep following up. And sometimes that doesn't even require that much time. It could just literally be a text message and a quick check-in. And this is one thing that I think about all the time is I think being an only child has made me more predispositioned to let relationships fall through the cracks because I didn't exactly learn how to connect with people and siblings and things like that, which we can dive into in another episode. I wanted to do an episode on siblings because James and I the other day were like comparing how we like to keep up with people, and I realized on a whole I don't think so much about it. The next tip is something that we've mentioned in the past in previous episodes that James actually mentioned, is it's really helpful to build in public and to do things in public too, if you are open to being a public person. I think it opens the door up to making connections that could be across the world that you would never have made otherwise. I think being chronically online is one, a bad thing, but also two, a good thing because you get to connect with other people very quickly. I think the most amazing times that you connect with someone are in very niche based projects. And so I think about the times that I do pottery and I create something and I put it out onto the internet and I connect with other people who do pottery, and it's very wholesome. And I think it actually happens a lot more for James because he's in a craft-based niche, so he connects a lot with other people that do fashion design and create clothes. And so it's really cool to see those relationships form because I feel like when it comes to online connections you make, it is most of the time very wholesome, sometimes a little bit knowledge-based, and then other times a little bit more social status based. But building in public, I think, is always such a good hack for networking. The next tip is be a connector. And by that, I mean, host things, be willing to be the person that connects other people and be willing to be the host of small gatherings and events. And I've actually noticed that you kind of get a full range of different types of networking when you are the host. It kind of just comes naturally because you invite someone, you tell them to invite their friends, and then suddenly you're hosting a dinner party with a mix of people that you know and people that you don't know. And the cool thing about being an adult is you start randomly meeting people in such different lives and walks of life. I feel like the one-off times that I've hosted big roof parties in my old Brooklyn apartment, I've met 10 plus people through that. And usually those people are really cool, have different careers. I think I've met backup dancers and news hosts, journalists, different people through these parties. And the nice thing about being a host is if you have anxiety going to parties, you usually don't have as much anxiety if you're hosting it because you know that you know half of the people at least. And that's for me though. I might just be assuming that other people feel this way, but I do think the benefit to hosting is people are naturally inclined to introduce their plus ones to you. So you kind of have a nice in with new people that you meet through hosting. On a professional front too, I've seen people host events where they're invite your creative friends, invite other creatives or invite other girls in tech that you know, and it just creates a great community because everyone has commonalities. But then you also get to meet new people and connect and form new social networks. This next tip is show gratitude. I think gratitude is always really important when it comes to leaving a good impression on people and going back to the whole ethics and morals around networking. I think when you are grateful and you show thanks and you remind people how much you appreciate them, it keeps the relationship very pure and fresh, even if the underlying tone is that you need help with your career or how to do ceramics. I love that I keep throwing this example out because I actually don't have that many ceramics friends and people that I've networked with just purely for ceramics, but it is one of the skills that I probably do need more friends in. But anyways, I do think that being grateful and always sending a thank you message leaves a really lasting impact. And something that I wanted to say is when it comes to making impressions, obviously the first impression matters a lot, but the end impression is what lasts for longer. And so let's say you have like a semi good chat with someone for like 10 minutes, but at the end you say something very kind or you say something that really impresses them. That is what carries for the remainder of the day or week. And this is why I'm a huge proponent of writing little thank you DMs or thank you messages after you hang out with someone or after you meet someone for the first time, because I think that creates a lasting impression that allows people to have a really fond impression of you. And so yeah, express gratitude, and it's always free to say thank you and it's always free to be grateful. So why not? And then one last parting life wisdom that I wanted to give is it's okay to have friends that only fit into certain categories of your life and of your network. I think the thing that I regret the most is I always wanted to fit everyone in my network into this category of friends that I vibe with. And that negatively affected me because I think early in my 20s, whenever I met someone and made a connection, I would always want to lump them into this friend category. And so if they were someone that I met, for example, at work, and, you know, I met them through another coworker, that I would try to make them a full-fledged friend. I would try to hang out with them, try to do certain fun things with them. And if I didn't vibe with them, then I felt like they weren't valuable to my network because I didn't connect with them on a personal level. And I think that's the biggest misconception, that everyone in your network you have to adore and love and resonate with and be friends with and could see yourself as like best friends with them, when a lot of the times a big, vast network that supports you in life is one where people fit into different categories. So maybe I would never, you know, invite my work mentor to a party that I host, but it's not like I shouldn't do my quarterly check-ins with him. And the same thing goes for if I have a wholesome connection, friendship with someone I met at the pottery studio, I shouldn't always expect them to be there to support me on a career front. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying in the friendship episode, where it's okay for your friends to only fit certain categories in your life. That they don't have to, your party friends don't have to be the friends that you go to when you're going through a breakup, and your friends that you connect with on a hobby don't have to be your friends that you talk to about your work. But yeah, I just wanted to say that. Hi, Moosey. Also, Moosey just came by. Do you want to say something, Moosey? He has so much to say about this topic. But I've learned the hard way that certain people take on certain roles in your life, but it's natural for them to not mesh in the ways that you necessarily want them to, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be in your network. Anyways, hopefully that unveiled a little bit of the world of networking, and I think everyone goes down their own journey of figuring out what networking means to them and how they like to approach it. But those were just some things that I've kind of processed through the last decade of my existence. I know we literally talked for like an hour about networking, but on a whole, I'm also just always at home, dormant, doing my own thing. And I actually don't network nearly as much as I should, but hopefully that was helpful. And if you guys want to hear more of these 101 classes, let me know, and let me know what topics you want to hear about. I think this one was a little bit more of a breakdown of something that I think we don't talk about nearly as much. So yeah, always open to hearing feedback. And if you guys want to leave us a comment, a like, or a rating on Spotify, please do. Thank you guys for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your week. Bye.